I want to share a story in the Bible about a man who started off to be a stubborn deceiver, but learned to lean into God. This man's name was Jacob, and his name actually means deceiver. But I want you to turn over to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 21, and it says this, that it was by faith that Jacob, the deceiver, when he was old and dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and bowed in worship as he leaned on his staff. I want to let you know that that staff represented something to Jacob. It wasn't just that Jacob was an old guy, and because he was an older guy, he had to have a staff to get around. No, that staff represented something that happened to him while he was still a young man, an encounter that he had with the Lord where he wrestled the Lord all through the night, and he prevailed. And the Lord touched his hip socket, put it out of place, so that for the rest of his life, here Jacob the deceiver, now his name is changed to Israel, and he's walking with a limp. I want to look out here at the crowd, and I want to ask you, are you still walking with a limp? Are you still walking with a limp that causes you to lean into God? Are you remembering what he's done in your life? Or was that just for a moment back in history somewhere, and you're no longer following that same example of leaning into him? What are you leaning on today, my friend? Who are you leaning on today? Because we all lean on something, right? Jacob had a staff of deception, and he leaned on it, and it worked pretty well for him. I mean, he ended up getting the birthright from his older brother Esau, because he took some stew, and at the opportune moment, whenever Esau was so famished, I guess he felt like he was going to die, Jacob's like, I'll tell you what, I've got some stew that I made up here. If you give me your birthright, Esau, then I'll give you this stew. And we'll look at Esau and we're like, wow, what is wrong with Esau? How could he do that? Why would he give that away? But I look at it and I say, what was wrong with Jacob? That here, Esau, this is Esau's brother. If anybody should be looking out for Esau, it should be Jacob. I mean, Jacob should be able to give his brother some stew whenever his brother is hungry without asking anything in return from him. And then later on, as Isaac, their father, was dying, it says that Isaac was blind. And he asked Esau, he said, Esau, go out and kill me that food that I really like. And you know how to cook it just right. Esau was like the chef of the family, and he was also the hunter of the family. Well, Jacob wasn't. He kind of stayed around the tent with his mama. And so Jacob and his mama, they devised this plan that while Esau is out, and this is a Bible lesson that you all know, but just entertain me for a little bit here because I'm going somewhere with this. And while Esau is out, Jacob and his mama devised this plan that Jacob is going to go in and he is going to deceive his father Isaac. His wife knows how to cook him the exact food that he likes. She even gets some of the hair off of that food. I don't know how they affixed it onto Jacob's hands and onto his chest or whatever, but Esau was a hairy man. Jacob was a smooth man. And whenever he came close to his father's like, I hear the voice of Jacob, but I can smell the smell of my son Esau. And he said, come close. And then in that, he gave Jacob the blessing, the fatherly blessing that belonged to the older son, Esau. Now here's the thing. This staff seemed to be working for him, this staff of deception. But if he would have remembered back to his grandfather, Abraham, he would have remembered something very important from Abraham's story where Abraham realized that God was his exceeding great reward. He would have understood that promotion doesn't come through my deception, but it comes through God and God alone. Listen, some of you have staffs that have worked for you. You have staffs that you've been able to lean on. But there was a moment in time in your life where you said, God, this staff isn't enough for me. I need you. I need to walk with a limp. Oh God, would you take this staff and give me another? And then he gives you another staff and you're walking with it for a while. And it seems good and it's working for you and you're learning to lean on him. And then all of a sudden some hardships of life come along and the enemy, the devil, comes along and he says, I've got another staff for you. Remember that staff that you put down way back when? You remember Jacob? I've got another staff for you. You know it's getting hard. I told you it was going to be hard to serve God, to follow him. I told you he was going to ask things of you that you didn't really want to give up. Why don't you give me that staff back? Because I've got that other staff that you laid down. And let me tell you something. I believe that the enemy has a collection of spiritual staffs that people have laid down. And he goes to them and he remembers each one. And he has a name on each one. So, Jacob, don't you remember when you were a deceiver? See, some of you, for you, it's relationships. You go from one bad relationship to another bad relationship, and you're leaning on that staff, and it seems to work, and then all of a sudden, things crumble underneath of you. And you're like, well, maybe I can go to another relationship or another relationship. And eventually what happens is that staff can no longer support you. And it cracks right out from underneath you. And you look to God and you blame him. You said, God, you gave me this staff. And the Lord looks at you and he says, I didn't give you that staff. You picked something else back up that I never gave you. I told you to forsake that staff, and you started to put your trust in that thing again, and you saw that it buckled under the weight of the purpose and the will of God for your life. Proverbs says in Proverbs 3, it says, lean not on your own understanding. Acknowledge God in all of your ways, and he will direct your paths. Some of us, we have been leaning on a staff of our own understanding, even after we became a Christian. We're a Christian by name, but yet our lifestyle says, I'm still a man who leans on my own understanding instead of leaning into Jesus. And so here Jacob is, he's got to leave his house because once Esau came back, he was mad, he was livid. He said, once I get done mourning my father Isaac, because Isaac just then died, he said, once I get done mourning for him, I'm going after Jacob and I am going to kill him. And so Jacob and his mama, they're like, okay, we got to do something different. You're going to go live with your uncle Laban. And he gets to Laban's house, but what he doesn't realize is that Laban's a bigger deceiver than what Jacob ever was. And he gets there at Laban's house and he's working for him and Laban changes the wages 10 times. And this isn't like cost of living changing in wages, okay? This isn't like we're going to raise your pay $1.50 because inflation has gone up. No, this is him cutting his wages 10 times. Can you imagine that? In like 21 years of work, he's cutting back and cutting back and cutting back. And with the sweat and tears and blood, here Jacob is shepherding Laban's flock, getting nothing for it. And really what Jacob asked for was Rachel. We all know how that story goes, right? I want Rachel. I don't want Leah. And the night of their wedding, after Jacob's worked several years for Rachel, it's just how they did it back then. He wakes up the next morning and he realizes, I wasn't with Rachel at all. As the sunlight peeks through the window, he sees that it was Leah there next to him. And once again, Laban becomes the bigger deceiver. Because see, what you sow, that will you also reap. So Jacob was reaping something that he had sowed, and he was reaping something out of his own family. And so what does Jacob do? He returns the deception with more deception. He finds a way to get all of the cattle of Laban. And I don't even know exactly how he did it. I don't even understand it even when I read it today, but somehow he got all the spotted and striped animals. And in the very end, we have Jacob fleeing from Laban's house with his kids and with his wives and with all of the flock of Laban. And where's he going to? He's going back to his homeland. Who's in his homeland? Esau. So here he's got Laban behind him who wants to kill him. And in front of him, he has Esau, for all he knows, that wants to kill him. Now let me ask you a question. Have you ever been in a desperate situation? Like you left out of something behind you seemed to be pursuing you from your past, or pursuing you from your present, and then as you were walking towards your past, something was there to meet with you. How many of you have ever been in a moment of desperation? You know what I'm talking about. Where it's like, God, where do I go? I don't know where else to lean. Everything that I had leaned on is just breaking. Everything that I had put my hope in and my trust in is just breaking. Sometimes what we do is this right here. This is a yardstick. We take our staff, and I've got this staff, it's not very big. I don't really like this staff. Lord, I don't like the staff that you gave me because it doesn't look like the other staff. It doesn't look like this one. I mean, look how sturdy this one is, and you gave me this staff, but I liked what so-and-so staff looks like. And we get the yardstick out and we begin to measure where we're at with where other people are at. And we say, no, God, I don't want this. I want their staff. And so we do what we can to grab out their staff and walk with it. And what we realize is that we don't have the grace on our life from the Lord to walk with the staff that they walked with, because we've not gone through what they've gone through. And God hadn't called us exactly to what He called them to. But we look with longing and envy. Jacob walked with the staff of deception, but he also walked with the staff of pride. I wonder how many of us in here where we've walked with pride. And pride will give you a limp too. It'll hurt you. See, the limp that Jacob got from wrestling with the angel, that was not a painful limp. That was a moment where he prevailed with God. That was a moment where he pressed in. That was a moment where he stopped leaning on his own understanding. That was a moment where he said, I cannot walk with deception anymore. I cannot walk with a staff of pride anymore, because it all keeps on breaking and shattering underneath me. Are you guys with me? Turn with me to Genesis 32. Genesis 32 and verse 1. It says, Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. Wow. Isn't it amazing that God had something better for Jacob? Isn't it amazing that God has something better planned for you? In verse 22, it says, the same night he arose and he took his 2 wives and his 2 female servants and his 11 children, and they crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had, and Jacob was left alone. How many of you ever felt alone? Yeah? You know what I'm talking about? You felt alone. I don't have Laban anymore. I don't have Esau anymore. I'm running out of friends to connect with. Here Jacob is. He's left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, let me go, for the day has broken. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. In other words, he said, I'm a deceiver. This is what I am. This is who I am. This is all I know how to be. How many of you, when you came to Jesus, you had to be honest with Him? And He says, who are you? And you just had to say, you know what? I'm a sinner. I'm a sinner. I'm not even going to pretend that I'm anything else outside of a holy, powerful, pure, awesome God who knows everything. You already know what's in my heart. You already know how I governed my life before. See, some of us, we need to come honest again with God. Then he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob. Here's the identity shift right here. But your name shall be called Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you ask my name? And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. I love that he passed Peniel. He didn't stay there. It was the most significant outpouring in his life. Why didn't he stay there? Because God never calls us to worship a place or a moment or a monument. But he calls us to go forward. God's on the move, so we need to be on the move with him. Think about it. He gave you the Holy Spirit. Why? To make you a mobile upper room. I don't have to go back to Jerusalem and find the upper room anymore, because the Holy Spirit that empowered the disciples on the day of Pentecost has taken up residence inside of me. Genesis 32, verse 22 and 23, I want to draw your attention to this real quick as the worship team comes forward. So Jacob wrestled with God at the river called Jabbok. Jabbok, if you're taking notes. The word Jabbok means pouring out. It indeed represented the work of God's Spirit in a life during times of deep wrestling and change. Let me ask you a question today, my friend. Have you come to the river Jabbok? Are you in need of an outpouring in your life? And before you say, no, I think I'm good. No, I think I'm fine. Just consider D.L. Moody. Listen to what he says. The revivalist said, those who desire to see revival must approach the river Jabbok and wrestle until they realize that God works best through newly named limping leaders. How true. Jacob's name was changed, and all that he could do when his hip was dislocated was hold on, for he could not stand by his own power anymore. He said, the man who is the lowest down is the man God lifts the highest. The man that has the greatest humility will be the most exalted. But the only way to get there, listen to me, young person, listen to me, old person. The only way to get there is sometimes to wrestle with God at the river Jabbok for that outpour of God that we so desperately need. Don't stop wrestling with God. I want to tell you a story about a great revival that happened. Can I do that? This is what I want to close with. 1949, one of the greatest revivals in the history of the United Kingdom took place in the Hebrides. Duncan Campbell was the preacher at the center of that revival. He later described how it began. Said 7 men and 2 women had decided to pray earnestly for revival. One night at a prayer meeting held in a barn, a young man took his Bible and read from Psalm 24. Who may ascend the mountain of the Lord? Who may stand in his holy place? The one who has clean hands and a pure heart. He shut his Bible and said, it seems to me just so much sentimental humbug to be praying as we are praying, to be waiting as we are waiting here if we ourselves are not rightly related to God. He asked God to reveal if his own hands were clean and his own heart was pure. That night, God met with them in a powerful way. As they waited on God, his awesome presence swept the barn. They came to understand that revival is always related to holiness. A power was let loose that shook the church. 3 men were lying on the straw, having fallen under the power of God. They were lifted out of the ordinary into the extraordinary. This was all stuff that Duncan Campbell wrote. They knew that God had visited them, and neither they nor their church could ever be the same again. 4 miles away, 2 sisters, ages 82 and 84, had a vision of God. They saw the churches crowded and the youth and the community flocking into the churches. They had a glorious assurance that God was coming in revival power. Duncan Campbell was invited to come and speak to them. When he arrived in the church, it was packed out with hundreds waiting outside. No one could explain where they had come from. Within 10 minutes of the service starting, men and women were crying out to God. They were meeting with God in all of his holiness. There was such a sense of the presence of God on the island that a businessman visiting said, the moment I stepped ashore, I was suddenly conscious of the presence of God. God was meeting with his people. Now here's the question for you and I as you stand to your feet. Stand to your feet. How do you and I meet with God? How do you and I walk with a limp? How do we draw near to him? The recipe for drawing near to God has never changed. You want to know what it is? It's simple. It's a holy desperation. I've got to have a holy desperation to meet with God. How was Jacob able to meet with God? Because he was in desperation. His life was on the line. Are you saying, well, the only way to be in desperation is for my life to be on the line? No, my friend. But I am saying that there needs to be a revelation, a realization that you desperately need God today as much as you did whenever you felt like your life was falling apart. That in the mundane, ordinary days of life, maybe those are the days more than ever that you need to say, I need to press into you, God. I need to lean on you. You're the only one worth leaning on. So I want you to be honest with the Lord this morning. Are you a person who has stopped your pursuit of Jesus? Have you forgotten to lean into Him? Are you desperate? Are you desperate? Are you hungry? Have you realized that there's nobody else and nowhere else you can go who can really satisfy you quite like Jesus? Here's what I'm going to do. As they're singing, I want to turn this place into a place where we meet with God. I believe He wants to meet with you in a very profound way this morning. You've walked, you're leaning on a staff. Maybe that wasn't a staff that God gave you. But today, even now as a Christian, you're like, you know what? I noticed that I've been leaning on this staff. And Lord, I give it to you. I lay it at your feet. Jesus, take the staff. Jesus, take the staff. Jesus, take all of these other staffs that I've been leaning on, that I've found purpose in. Take them all. Lord, give me your staff. I want to lean into you. If that's you today, you want to lean into God. You know you need to lean into God this morning. He is calling you to a place of outpouring where He wants to pour into your life like never before. We're opening these altars right now. I want to encourage you to step out of your seat and come. Come right now. As the worship team leads us, come right now.